It's strange how you can live in the same house with someone, share meals, conversations, a bed, and yet feel like they've become a stranger. That's how it had been with Sarah for months, though I couldn't pinpoint the exact moment things started changing. Maybe it was one of those imperceptible shifts, like when a crack appears in a dam. You don't notice it at first, but the water slowly finds its way through, until one day the whole thing gives out. We had been married for 11 years, and by most accounts ours was a good marriage. Solid, dependable. We didn't have screaming matches or dramatic fallouts. Our disagreements were the quiet kind. Muttered words over who forgot to take the trash out, or me rolling my eyes when she bought yet another throw pillow for the couch. I thought that was normal, comfortable, the kind of relationship people envied. But looking back, maybe that comfort was the problem. Sarah and I had gotten too good at existing around each other rather than with each other. The silences that used to be companionable had grown heavier, weighted with things left unsaid. She'd spend hours on her phone at night, the glow of the screen reflecting off her face as she sat on the other end of the couch. I told myself it was harmless, work emails, Pinterest boards, maybe scrolling Instagram. Everyone was glued to their phones these days. But sometimes, when I glanced over, she'd tilt the screen away, as if protecting it from my view. Then there were the late nights. She was a marketing consultant, and her job often required her to attend client events or meet with vendors. At first, I didn't think much of it. Her schedule had always been unpredictable, and she loved what she did. But over time, her excuses became more frequent, more elaborate. One night, it was a client dinner that ran late. Another time, a last-minute event she just had to oversee. And yet, when I asked about the projects she was working on, her answers were vague, almost rehearsed. I tried to push the doubts aside. Sarah wasn't the type to do something underhanded. She was practical, organized, someone who liked her life predictable. And we were predictable, stable. That's why, when my mind wandered to darker places, I'd tell myself I was imagining things. Still, the doubts lingered. One afternoon, I came home from work earlier than usual. It wasn't planned. I had wrapped up a meeting early, and I thought I'd surprise Sarah by picking up her favorite coffee on the way home. As I walked up to the house, I noticed her car in the driveway. I smiled, imagining her inside, maybe curled up with a book or experimenting with one of the recipes she loved to try out on weekends. But when I opened the door, the house felt wrong. Too quiet. Sarah always had music playing, or the TV on in the background. But that day, it was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. I called out for her, and when there was no response, I walked through the house, checking each room. It wasn't until I reached our bedroom that I noticed something strange. The bed, which we'd made together that morning, was rumpled, one of the pillows on the floor. At first, I thought maybe she had taken a nap, but then I saw the shirt draped over the armchair in the corner. It wasn't mine. The shirt was black, too small to be mine, and smelled faintly of cologne, a scent I didn't recognize. I stood there for a long time, holding the shirt, trying to process what I was seeing. My thoughts felt like static, a jumble of emotions that I couldn't untangle. Anger, confusion, fear. I wanted to storm out of the house, call her, demand an explanation. But a part of me wasn't ready for the answers. That night, I didn't say anything. When Sarah came home, carrying takeout bags and humming to herself, I pretended everything was fine. I told myself I needed more time, more evidence, before I confronted her. Over the next few weeks, I started paying closer attention. I tracked her routines, asked subtle questions about her day. I checked her phone when she was in the shower, only to find that her messages were clean, too clean. It was like she had scrubbed them, erasing every trace of anything suspicious. And yet, the signs kept piling up. She started dressing differently. Sleek dresses, high heels, outfits that didn't fit the laid-back style she'd always preferred. She told me it was for work, that her clients expected a certain level of polish. I wanted to believe her, but then there were the moments when she'd slip up, mention a meeting I knew she wasn't supposed to have or a name I didn't recognize. One night, I asked her outright if everything was okay. I told her I felt like we were drifting apart, that I missed her. She smiled at me, her eyes bright but distant, and told me not to worry. She said she loved me, that we were just in a rut. But her words felt hollow, like a performance she was putting on for my benefit. I decided to stop waiting for the truth to reveal itself. If there was something going on, I was going to find out. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. Sarah had an overnight work trip coming up, and as usual, I offered to drive her to the airport. She hesitated for a moment, her smile faltering, before thanking me and saying she'd already arranged a ride with a colleague. That was the first time I'd ever seen her nervous, and it sent a shiver down my spine. The night of her trip, I followed her. As I watched her car pull out of the driveway and head in the opposite direction of the airport, I felt my chest tighten. My hands gripped the steering wheel as I trailed her at a safe distance, my mind racing with possibilities I didn't want to consider. And then, she pulled into the parking lot of a small boutique hotel, the kind with dimly lit windows and an air of discretion. My heart sank as I watched her step out of the car, phone in hand, her eyes scanning the lot. Moments later, a man appeared, walking toward her with a confident stride. I told myself to stay calm, to wait, to think. But as I watched them embrace, laughing like two people who had the world at their feet, something inside me snapped. I had the truth I'd been searching for, but I wasn't prepared for what would come next. The next morning, Sarah returned home as if nothing had happened. She walked in with her suitcase in tow, humming softly and asking if the kids had been any trouble while she was gone. Her demeanor was infuriatingly normal, and for a moment, I questioned if I had dreamed the entire thing. But the image of her and that man embracing in the hotel parking lot was burned into my mind, sharper and more vivid than anything I'd ever seen. I didn't confront her. Not yet. I needed to understand the full extent of what was going on before I tipped my hand. The worst thing I could do was accuse her without knowing the whole truth. If she was lying about this, what else had she hidden from me? I decided to start small. That afternoon, I went into our bedroom while Sarah was on the phone in the kitchen. Her suitcase was still lying open on the bed, half unpacked. Among her neatly folded clothes, I noticed a receipt from the hotel, just a corner sticking out of a pocket in her travel tote. The receipt confirmed everything. The name of the hotel, the date of her stay, and the name of the person who had checked in with her. His name was Elliot, and my stomach twisted as I read it. I closed the suitcase carefully, making sure everything looked exactly as it had before. My hands were shaking, but I kept my expression neutral as I rejoined her downstairs. She was sitting on the couch, scrolling through her phone, her face relaxed and unreadable. I told myself to stay calm, to act like nothing was wrong, but the rage boiling inside me made it almost unbearable. In the following days, I started to put the pieces together. I watched her more closely, paid attention to the little details I'd been overlooking. She was on her phone constantly, always smiling at texts she wouldn't let me see. Her late nights became more frequent, and when she wasn't home, I started tracking her movements using the location sharing feature on her phone. It was all there. Every lie, every betrayal. Her client dinners were evenings spent at restaurants I'd never heard her mention before, often just a short drive from the boutique hotel I had seen her at. She was meticulous, careful not to leave behind anything incriminating at home, but she hadn't anticipated how much I was paying attention now. One night, when she told me she was meeting a client at a downtown bar, I decided to test her. I told her I'd swing by to drop off the USB drive she said she needed for work. She froze for a second, her smile faltering, before quickly reassuring me that it wasn't necessary. She said she'd already borrowed one from a coworker, but her voice had that strained, overly casual tone she used when she was lying. I didn't let it show, but her reaction confirmed what I already suspected. She wasn't meeting a client. She was meeting him. By this point, I had more than enough evidence to confront her, but something held me back. It wasn't fear, it was curiosity. I needed to understand why. Why had she done this? Why risk everything we had built together? I thought about the early days of our relationship, the nights we'd spent talking for hours, sharing secrets and dreams. I thought about the first time I saw her laugh so hard she cried, and the way she used to look at me like I was the only man in the world. Where had all of that gone? I wanted answers, but I knew I wouldn't get them by exploding in anger. So instead, I planned. The opportunity came 2 weeks later. Sarah told me she had to go out of town again, this time for a conference that would last the entire weekend. I nodded, pretending to believe her, and offered to help her pack. She smiled at me, her eyes flickering with relief, and told me she had it under control. That Friday after she left, I followed her. This time I was prepared. I had borrowed a friend's car, so she wouldn't recognize mine, and I stayed far enough behind to avoid suspicion. As expected, she drove straight to the same boutique hotel. I parked a block away and waited, my heart pounding in my chest. After about 20 minutes, I saw him, Elliot. He was tall, clean-shaven, and exuded the kind of confidence that made my blood boil. I watched as Sarah greeted him in the parking lot, her smile radiant, her body language so warm and open it was like she'd completely forgotten I existed. I stayed in my car, watching them disappear into the hotel, my thoughts a chaotic mess. This was it, the confirmation I needed, the irrefutable proof of her betrayal. But instead of feeling the relief I'd expected, I felt hollow, like a piece of me had been ripped away, leaving behind a raw, gaping wound. I wanted to confront them right then and there, to storm into the hotel and expose them for the liars they were. But I knew that wouldn't accomplish anything. I needed to stay calm, to think this through. That night, I didn't go home. Instead, I checked into a cheap motel on the other side of town and sat in the dark, trying to make sense of everything. I thought about the kids, about how this would affect them. I thought about our marriage, our life together, and whether it had all been a lie. By the time the sun came up, I had made my decision. I wasn't going to confront her, not yet. Instead, I was going to let her dig her own grave. I would gather every piece of evidence, every lie she had told, and I would use it to take back control of my life. This wasn't just about betrayal anymore. It was about rebuilding, about finding a way to pick up the pieces and move forward. But before I could do that, I needed to see just how far Sarah was willing to go to protect her secret. The days that followed were surreal. I had all the evidence I needed to confront Sarah, but instead, I found myself going through the motions of daily life like nothing had changed. Breakfast with the kids, dropping them off at school, work meetings, dinner at the table. It all felt hollow, like I was playing a part in some elaborate charade. Sarah returned home from her so-called conference that Sunday evening, a spring in her step and a fake glow of accomplishment plastered across her face. She kissed me on the cheek like she always did, as if the last 48 hours hadn't been spent in a hotel room with another man. I told myself to stay calm, to keep playing my role until I was ready to reveal the truth. But it wasn't easy. Every smile she gave me, every casual conversation we had, felt like another twist of the knife. I started noticing things I had overlooked before. The way she'd avoid eye contact when I asked about her day, or how she'd get defensive over the smallest questions. Once, I casually mentioned that I'd like to visit her office sometime, and she froze for half a second before brushing me off with a tight smile. It was infuriating, watching her weave her web of lies with such ease. But instead of confronting her, I kept digging. I started checking her phone more frequently, usually when she was in the shower or asleep. Most of her messages were clean, but every now and then, I'd catch a cryptic text from Elliot. They never mentioned anything explicit, just vague references to catching up or that amazing weekend. She was careful I'd give her that, but not careful enough. One day, while she was at work, I logged into her email account. It wasn't hard. She used the same password for everything. What I found there made my stomach churn. There were dozens of emails from Elliot, some of them dating back months. Most were innocuous, just casual banter or work-related questions. But others hinted at something deeper, shared plans, private jokes, and a familiarity that no coworker should have with a married woman. The worst was a chain of emails from the week before her conference. In one, she had sent him a link to the boutique hotel's website, asking if he preferred the deluxe suite or the standard room. His reply had been flirty, full of winking emojis and suggestions that made my blood boil. I printed everything out, emails, texts, even her hotel receipt. I wasn't sure what I planned to do with it all, but I knew I needed to have it. Proof. Something tangible to hold onto in the face of her lies. As the weeks went by, I began to notice more cracks in her facade. She started slipping up in conversations, contradicting herself or forgetting the details of her made-up stories. One evening, she mentioned a meeting she'd had with a client, only to later claim the same client had canceled at the last minute. I didn't call her out on it. There was no point. But I kept track of every inconsistency, every misstep. It wasn't just her lies that bothered me. It was the sheer audacity of it all. She acted like she had nothing to hide, like I was too blind or too trusting to ever catch on. I told myself I was waiting for the right moment to confront her, but the truth was, I wasn't ready. What scared me the most was how good she was at this. If I hadn't started digging, I never would have known. How many times had she looked me in the eye, smiled, and told me she loved me while hiding this massive betrayal? How long had this been going on? I started to feel like I was living a double life. To the outside world, we were the perfect couple. A stable, happy family with 2 beautiful kids and a nice home. But behind closed doors, I was unraveling. I spent nights lying awake, replaying everything I'd seen and heard, trying to make sense of it all. One day, I decided to follow her again. She had told me she was meeting a friend for lunch, but my gut told me otherwise. Sure enough, she drove to a small cafe on the other side of town and met Elliot. I parked a few blocks away and watched from a distance as they sat at a corner table, their heads close together, laughing and smiling like 2 people without a care in the world. I didn't confront them. I just sat there, watching, feeling like an intruder in my own life. That evening, Sarah came home and told me her lunch had been fine. She mentioned a few details about her friend, spinning an elaborate story about their conversation that I knew was a lie. I nodded along, pretending to believe her, while every word she said drove another nail into the coffin of our marriage. But I wasn't done yet. The next step in my plan was to find out more about Elliot. Who was he? What kind of man was willing to carry on an affair with a married woman? I started searching online, combing through social media and professional profiles until I found him. He was a project manager at a mid-sized firm, divorced, no kids. His posts were full of motivational quotes and gym selfies, the kind of stuff that screamed wannabe alpha male. As I scrolled through his profile, I noticed a pattern. He had a habit of liking and commenting on Sarah's posts, even the ones that seemed insignificant. A picture of our family at the park? Liked. A post about her new haircut? Looking great. It made me sick. But it also gave me an idea. If Sarah and Elliot thought they could keep their little secret hidden, they were wrong. I was done playing the clueless husband, done pretending everything was fine. It was time to turn the tables. I wasn't just going to confront Sarah. I was going to expose the whole affair, make them both face the consequences of their actions. But first, I needed one final piece of evidence. Something undeniable, something they couldn't talk their way out of. I told myself it would be worth it, that the truth would set me free. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that once I pulled the trigger, there'd be no going back. The final piece of evidence came unexpectedly. I wasn't even looking for it that night. I'd been sitting at the dining table, staring at the neat stack of papers I'd printed. The emails, the texts, the receipts. It was all there, a collection of betrayals spelled out in black and white. I'd replayed my confrontation in my mind 1,000 times. How I'd approach her, how I'd say the words, how she'd try to deny it, and how I'd crush her lies with undeniable proof. But when the moment came, it wasn't on my terms. Sarah's phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. She had gone upstairs to take a shower, and the screen lit up with a name I knew too well. Elliot. The message previewed for just a second, something about meeting again soon, and then it disappeared behind her lock screen. I don't know what came over me. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was the months of suspicion and the quiet rage I'd been bottling up. But I grabbed the phone and unlocked it. She had always been careless, using the same passcode for everything. The thread between her and Elliot stretched back further than I expected. Months of texts, photos, and plans made behind my back. My stomach churned as I read them, but I couldn't stop myself. Last weekend was amazing. I can't stop thinking about you. I'll come up with another excuse soon. Can't wait to see you again. You're worth every risk. You know that? And then the photos. Nothing explicit, but intimate enough to make my hands tremble. Pictures of them together, smiling, laughing, their heads close as if they belonged in their own little world. I felt a cold, sinking sensation in my chest as I scrolled through the messages. It wasn't just physical. There was an emotional connection here, a bond that had no place in my marriage. It was the kind of connection Sarah and I used to have before everything started to fall apart. I put the phone back on the counter, my mind racing. I had seen enough. When Sarah came downstairs, she was wearing one of her comfortable lounge sets, her damp hair pulled back in a messy bun. She looked so normal, so at ease, that for a moment I felt like I was the one going insane. How could she carry on like this, knowing what she was doing? I told her we needed to talk. She froze for a split second, her expression unreadable, before nodding and sitting across from me at the table. I didn't yell. I didn't throw accusations. I laid the evidence in front of her, the printed emails, the texts, the receipts. Her face went pale as she looked at it, her hands trembling as she picked up the papers. I told her I knew about Elliot. I told her I knew about the hotel, the late nights, the lies. I told her I had given her every opportunity to tell me the truth, but she had chosen to deceive me instead. For a moment, she didn't say anything. She just sat there, staring at the pile of evidence like it was a bomb waiting to go off. Then, finally, she looked up at me. She didn't deny it. Instead, she started crying. Not the kind of crying that comes with guilt or remorse, but the quiet, hopeless kind, like someone who had been caught in a trap they couldn't escape. She said she never meant for it to go this far, that it had started as a harmless distraction, a way to escape the monotony of our lives. She said Elliot made her feel alive in a way she hadn't felt in years. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I told her I had tried. I had tried to make her happy, tried to reconnect with her, tried to fix what was broken between us. But none of it had mattered. She had already made her choice. I asked her if she loved him. Her silence was answer enough. In that moment, I felt something inside me break. The anger, the betrayal, the sadness. It all melted away, replaced by a cold, clear resolve. I told her I was done. I told her I didn't care about her excuses or her justifications. She had destroyed our marriage, and there was no coming back from that. She begged me to reconsider. She said she was willing to end things with Elliot, to go to therapy, to do whatever it took to make things right. But her words felt hollow, like they were coming from someone who was more afraid of the consequences than genuinely sorry for what she'd done. I told her I needed space. I packed a bag and left the house that night, driving aimlessly until I found myself at a small motel on the edge of town. I spent the night lying awake, staring at the ceiling and wondering how everything had fallen apart so quickly. The next morning, I called my lawyer. In the days that followed, Sarah tried everything to win me back. She wrote me long emails, left voicemails, even showed up at my office unannounced. She swore she would end things with Elliot, that she would do whatever it took to repair the damage. But I couldn't bring myself to believe her. The trust was gone. The life we had built together was in ruins, and I didn't see a way to rebuild it. What hurt the most wasn't just the affair. It was the realization that the person I thought I knew, the person I had trusted with my heart, had been capable of such deception. But as much as it hurt, I knew I had to let go. And so, I began the process of unraveling our lives piece by piece. The house, the finances, the custody arrangements for the kids. It all became a series of negotiations and legal battles, each one more draining than the last. Through it all, I held on to one thought. I would get through this. I would come out on the other side stronger, wiser, and ready to rebuild my life. But as the weeks turned into months, I realized there was one final twist to this story, something I hadn't seen coming. The months following the confrontation were a blur of lawyers, paperwork, and hollow conversations. I threw myself into the practicalities of the divorce, focusing on logistics to keep from dwelling on the emotional wreckage. The kids became my anchor, the reason I dragged myself out of bed every morning. Sarah moved out of the house within a few weeks, taking only what she needed to set up in a small apartment across town. We agreed on shared custody of the kids, rotating weeks, though the handoffs were always awkward. She tried to make small talk, to act like we were still capable of civility, but I couldn't bring myself to engage. Elliot, of course, was still in the picture. That much was obvious from the occasional whispers I overheard from the kids. How Mom's friend had joined them for dinner or picked them up from school one day. It stung, but I had made peace with it. If she wanted to build a life with the man who had helped destroy ours, that was her choice. I just hoped she would spare the kids the worst of it. And then, about 3 months into the divorce process, something happened that threw everything into chaos. It was a Tuesday morning, and I was rushing to get the kids ready for school. I had just poured cereal into 2 bowls when my phone buzzed on the counter. It was a text from Sarah. "Can we talk? It's important." I stared at the screen, debating whether to ignore her. But something about the phrasing caught my attention. There was an urgency in her tone that felt different from her usual attempts to patch things up. Against my better judgment, I replied, asking what was wrong. She called me immediately, her voice trembling as she spoke. "It's Elliot," she said. "Something's happened." I wasn't sure what I expected her to say next, but nothing could have prepared me for what she told me. Elliot had been arrested. Apparently, he had been under investigation for months for embezzling funds from the company where he worked. The police had executed a search warrant at his apartment the night before, uncovering mountains of evidence. Fake invoices, fraudulent accounts, the works. Sarah said she had no idea, but the authorities were now scrutinizing her as well, given her connection to him. The revelation was almost too much to process. I didn't know whether to laugh, cry, or scream. The man Sarah had thrown away our marriage for wasn't just a liar. He was a criminal. In the days that followed, more details emerged. Elliot had been skimming money from his company for years, funneling it into a personal account to fund his lavish lifestyle. Vacations, designer clothes, expensive dinners. It had all been paid for with stolen money. And Sarah, by association, had unknowingly benefited from it. She was frantic, calling me constantly to vent her fears and seek reassurance. She said she had no involvement, no knowledge of what he'd been doing, and I believed her. As much as I hated what she had done to me, I knew she wasn't the type to get involved in something illegal. But even if she wasn't complicit, her life was falling apart. Elliot had been her escape, her fresh start. And now he was facing prison time. The apartment she had moved into, the one Elliot had helped her furnish, had been paid for with embezzled funds. She was forced to move out, scrambling to find a new place she could afford on her own. For a brief moment, I felt a flicker of pity for her, but it was quickly drowned out by a grim sense of satisfaction. Actions have consequences, and Sarah was finally facing hers. The irony wasn't lost on me. She had chased excitement, passion, and a sense of adventure, only to end up with a man whose entire life was built on lies. Meanwhile, I had been left to pick up the pieces of the life we had built together, to rebuild something stable and secure for our kids. And yet, the unexpected twist didn't end there. About a month after Elliot's arrest, I received a letter in the mail. It was from Sarah. Not an email, not a text. A handwritten letter, something I hadn't seen from her in years. In the letter, she apologized. Not the shallow, self-serving apologies she had offered before, but a genuine, heartfelt acknowledgement of everything she had done. She admitted that she had been selfish, that she had taken our marriage for granted, that she had allowed herself to be swept up in something that was ultimately meaningless. She wrote about how her life had unraveled in the wake of Elliot's betrayal, how she had realized too late what she had lost. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She said she didn't deserve it, but she wanted me to know that she was sorry, that she regretted every decision that had led us to this point. I read the letter twice, then set it aside. I didn't know how to feel. Part of me wanted to tear it up, to reject her apology as too little, too late. But another part of me felt a strange sense of closure. For the first time since this nightmare began, it felt like the chapter was truly coming to an end. In the weeks that followed, I started to feel lighter. The divorce was finalized, the house was officially mine, and the kids were adjusting to the new normal. I had even started seeing someone, a woman I'd met through a mutual friend. It was early days, but there was something refreshing about being with someone who was honest, open, and kind. As for Sarah, she faded into the background of my life. We maintained a civil relationship for the sake of the kids, but that was it. Whatever love we had once shared was gone, replaced by a quiet, mutual understanding that we were better off apart. Looking back, I realized that the ending I had feared the most, losing Sarah, losing the life we had built together, wasn't the tragedy I thought it would be. In a way, it was a beginning, A chance to start over, to build a life that was stronger, more honest, and entirely my own. And as I watched the sun set one evening, my kids laughing in the backyard, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: peace.